Poverty, crunched by numbers and culture. Our thesis is, poverty should be measured by an absolute standard, a revised version of the OPM that is more compatible with the quality of life seen today in American society, with relative measures used as a check and balance system to avoid any demographic or circumstance being overlooked. In addition to these measures, we propose adding a measurement of one's distance from the threshold and their capabilities. In our culture, we tend to associate poverty with being poor or deprived. However, the concept of poverty is far more severe. When someone is impoverished, they lack the ability to be a mobile member of society. In relation to this idea, one's capabilities or capacity of what you can do and be are essentially not met by society when living in poverty. This social take on poverty differs greatly from that of the government. From an official standpoint, poverty is seen more as having insufficient resources, which then places you on a spectrum below the given poverty line. The ever-changing notion of poverty is accurately captured by Amartya in his text, Inequality, Reexamined, on page 107, when he says, "While the term poverty is used in rather different ways, there are some clear associations that constrain the concept, and we are not entirely free to characterize poverty in the way we like." This explanation demonstrates the various societal and governmental restraints on the term of poverty and its various associations and connotations in our daily lives. There are two major methods of determining poverty in the United States: the official poverty measure, OPM, and the supplemental poverty measure, SPM. Both systems measure resources in determining where citizens fall in terms of the poverty line. The OPM, developed by Molly Orshanky, is the method used from a governmental standard and incorporates the poverty threshold, which is essentially the amount of money spent on food for a family of four scaled down to the cheapest plan. This number is calculated by adjusting the original number for inflation by multiplying it by 3, converting this number to a dollar amount, and finally considering family size. On the other hand, the SPM is a more adjustable method in which household expenditures are initially analyzed, then graphed and surveyed for the 33rd percentile, and then finally a small amount is added to that number to better calculate the poverty threshold. The SPM includes many factors like cash income, government assistance, tax transfers, food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and other factors. In addition, the SPM also subtracts taxes, work-related transportation, and child care expenses from one's income for a more accurate calculation. There are many advantages and disadvantages of the official poverty measure. However, it is not necessarily favored due to the various inconveniences associated with this method. Primarily, the OPM is an older model with which there are decades' worth of data that can be used to analyze trends and compare today's current numbers. However, being an absolute measure means that the OPM cannot be adjusted and therefore is stuck with calculating strictly related family members and is strict to its baseline of a family of four. In addition, the official poverty measure does not assess the amount or degree of inequality below the poverty line, but rather just divides society between those that are impoverished and those that are not. Similarly, there are many advantages and disadvantages of the supplemental poverty measure. As a quasi-relative measure, the SPM sets the poverty threshold at the actual amount that everyone is spending. Therefore, it is adjustable and considers many factors in determining one's status in regard to the poverty threshold. As previously mentioned, some of these factors considered are cash income, governmental assistance, and tax transfers. In addition, one's geographical location will also be considered in determining their status in regard to SPM. It is evident that the SPM tries to include and evaluate all relevant social issues in order to determine the most accurate calculation of poverty in America. However, it is difficult to truly encompass all social issues into a system that works effectively. Because of this, the supplemental poverty measure is not the method used officially by the United States government.
Molly Orshanky created the OPM in the 1960s based off of how families spent their income. Orshanky discovered that Americans spent roughly one-third of their income on food and created a system based off of this statistic. However, Singer claims that Americans today are able to feed themselves for less than 6% of their income, which is noted in Saving a Child on page 6, meaning that there's a great imbalance between what the system was based off of and how people allocate their funds today. The system has not been updated to fit the patterns of Americans today, nor does it take into account any of the government programs like food stamps, TANF, rent help, taxes, or discretionary spending. As a food-based system, the OPM does not account for dips in the market of other resources like housing or transportation. While a food-based system makes sense in many ways, in today's society it's not as practical because it does not take into account the changes in the food industry. Cheap food, which the plan expects you to buy, is not high quality. The plan was also created based off of locally based food sources. However, today, almost all food sources are commercialized. When Orshanky created the system, she based it off a typical picture-perfect home of a husband, wife, and 2 children. The government decided to create guidelines for dependency based off of this picture. However, the family dynamic of America has changed greatly since then. People are counted as poor based off of their household. Therefore, it's not possible for just one individual in the household to be considered poor. The ruling stands for everyone. The OPM only accounts for children who are related by blood or by marriage, and a child's income is not considered until the age of 15, even if they are not members of the household. People not living in a household, for example, living in dorms, prisons, or serving in the military, are not counted as a part of that household. These guidelines limit the resources and aid available to those who have atypical family dynamics because it leaves them at risk of being excluded as poor. Because the OPM and SPM are both threshold measurements, they only measure who is above and who is below the threshold. If you make even 1 cent above the threshold, you are considered not poor. It is a strict cutoff, therefore there is no way to tell whether the majority of people lie just below the line or if they are very far from it. OPM and SPM are both ways to measure accessibility to resources through one's income level, which is related to the capabilities of the poor. However, it's not an actual measurement of human capabilities, nor does it assess the culture that surrounds the poor. OPM and SPM are both very valid ways to measure poverty, as OPM measures poverty levels across the country as a whole, and the SPM measures poverty relative to communities. However, it's difficult to see the whole picture by looking at just one measurement. The OPM does not take into account the deviation in price from living from community to community. Looking through a zoomed-out lens, the OPM offers insight into how the country is doing as a whole, but neglects to show the variance of poverty once below the threshold and how poverty changes from community to community. The SPM takes into account how one is doing compared to those around and is adjusted for geographical location. However, if seen alone, it can give a very deceptive perception of poverty. The SPM takes the bottom 33% from a survey of spending in the community and marks that as the poverty threshold. If the community as a whole is doing poorly, theoretically everyone in that community could be starving, but only the bottom 33% would be considered poor. While the SPM is a more up-to-date system, it looks through a very zoomed-in lens, which can make it difficult to see a clear picture of how the community is doing compared to others. The OPM allows for a view of how the country is doing as a whole in terms of poverty, which is useful when making policy and seeing trends across the board. Also, because the OPM was the first poverty measure and has been in place for the longest, there is the most data collected. There is no way to convert the data that has already been collected into a way that would be compatible with the SPM. Therefore, it is important to continue our use of the OPM to see trends over long periods of time. The OPM serves as the anchor for the government in determining who is poor. The SPM acts as more of a check and balance on the OPM because it assures that individual communities are looked at. It takes into account non-discretionary spending like clothing, shelter, utilities, and the addition of food costs. Its quasi-relative measures align more with how Americans are spending their income, and it has the ability to adjust as those variables change. A common misconception is that poverty is strictly confined to income levels, when in fact there are moral and cultural factors that play into poverty. For example, education, race, gender, geographical area, and parents' income and education levels are all major factors. The higher someone's education, the more likely they are going to be able to escape the poverty cycle.
Studies, like the one found in Chapter 8 of Marcus Genetti's Changing Poverty, Changing Policy, found that, quote, racial minorities and female-headed households are at greatest risk of both annual poverty and short-term poverty, end quote.
One's mobility through classes can be assessed through intergenerational elasticity, which is a regressional coefficient where 0 means there's equal opportunity regardless of parental income, and 1 being directly affected by parental income. According to Genetti, America has one of the highest rates at 0.45 compared to other industrialized nations with rates closer to 0.25. This illustrates how opportunity and therefore mobility is limited by the income level of the previous generation. Geographical location may help or hinder someone when it comes to the resources available to them. For example, Genetti found that most episodic poverty is more likely to occur with those living in metropolitan areas. Also, the culture that surrounds someone has a direct impact on their mental state. If someone feels oppressed because they are suffocated by the entitlement of others, they are more likely to be subjected to learned helplessness and never escape the grip of poverty. The Nussbaum assessed poverty based off of 10 capabilities, which they believe sum up what it means to be a dignified human, including life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reasoning, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. If one of these capabilities is violated, it is a sign of poverty. And when a person's dignity is compromised, they are often ashamed to go out in public. This is an important issue and a very important aspect of measuring poverty. However, there is no real way to measure it. The closest thing we have to measuring it is to assume that income relates directly to the access of materials, and the access of materials is related to capabilities. However, there is not a solid way to measure that these capabilities are intact for each individual below the poverty line. How the OPM measures poverty is effective, but the units it uses to create the poverty line are not. If the system were updated to align more with the spending of an American in today's society, or even more aligned to how the food industry works today instead of how it worked in the 1960s, the measure would be much more efficient. While many European countries exclusively use the SPM, America is much too large and would not do well using that measure alone. We think that SPM and the OPM should be used in tandem to create the most detailed picture of poverty in America to better allow policymakers insight on how to lower rates. There should be a way to further stratify those who are above and below the poverty line to measure their distance from the threshold. This will help policymakers decrease poverty rates without falsely lowering them by neglecting those who are at the bottom of the barrel. When there is an actual assessment of how poor someone is, instead of a simple yes or no answer that is currently given to us via the poverty threshold measurement, we will be able to better combat poverty. Although there is no real way to measure the culture of every community at risk of being swallowed by poverty, there are a few steps that can be taken to ensure capabilities are not violated. For the capabilities that can be measured, such as play, there should be a threshold of hours that one can work until their capability of play has been violated. In order to meet the senses, imagination, and thought capability, one must receive an adequate education with a basic understanding of math, science, and be able to read, which can easily be measured through standardized tests.